Story 1. Gardens on Water, the Aztec Chinampas, and the quiet triumph of floating farms. Imagine you are standing at the edge of Lake Xochimilco in the Valley of Mexico in the year 1500. The air is thin but fresh at this altitude, 2,200 meters above sea level, and the water lies still except for the slow movement of a canoe being poled across its surface. You see long, narrow plots of land, but they are not anchored to the lake bed in the way you expect. They seem to float, though they are heavy with earth, maize, beans, squash, and flowers. These are the Chinampas, the floating gardens that sustain the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. To understand the Chinampas, you must first understand the land, or rather, the lack of it. The Valley of Mexico was once a massive endorheic basin, a bowl that held several shallow lakes with no outlet to the sea. Seasonal rains would swell them, dry seasons would shrink them, leaving mudflats. Tenochtitlan, founded around 1325, was built on an island in Lake Texcoco. With a growing population, estimates range from 200,000 to 250,000. By the early 16th century, the Mexica people needed a way to turn the surrounding marsh into productive farmland. The Chinampa method was ingeniously simple, yet required meticulous labor. Builders began by staking out a rectangular plot in the shallow water, typically about 2.5 to 4 meters wide and 30 to 90 meters long. Between the stakes, they wove reeds and branches to form a fence-like perimeter. Into this enclosure, they dredged up lake mud and piled it above the water level. Over time, layers of mud, decaying vegetation, and organic refuse created rich, dark soil. Willows, ahujotes, were planted at the corners. Their deep roots stabilized the structure and prevented erosion. This was not land that merely floated free. The roots, stakes, and woven walls anchored each Chinampa to the lakebed, so it could withstand storms and waves. But the illusion of floating persisted, as the water channels between the plots glistened in the sunlight, creating a checkerboard of green and blue. Canoes navigated these channels, ferrying tools, crops, and people. From a modern agricultural perspective, Chinampas were astonishingly productive. The combination of nutrient-rich sediment, constant water access, and mild climate allowed for up to 7 harvests a year. Maize was a staple, but Chinamperos the farmers also grew amaranth, chili peppers, beans, tomatoes, and flowers for the markets of Tenochtitlan. The lake's ecosystem provided fish and waterfowl, further diversifying the diet. The work was constant. Each season required dredging more mud to replenish the soil, repairing the reed walls, and managing the water level. Weeds and pests had to be controlled without modern chemicals, though the constant moisture and biodiversity helped suppress large outbreaks naturally. The Chinamperos developed a rhythm: work in the cool morning hours, poling the canoe between plots, tending maize stalks heavy with ears, harvesting squash blossoms for market. Beyond their agricultural function, Chinampas were integrated into Aztec society's spiritual and political life. Land rights were carefully regulated by Calpulli kinship-based social units, and tribute payments in produce sustained both local leaders and the imperial capital. Rituals accompanied planting and harvest, invoking deities like Tlaloc, the rain god, and Chichimequotl, the maize goddess. Spanish chroniclers, arriving with Hernán Cortés in 1519, were struck by the sight. Bernal Díaz del Castillo described the city and its surrounding gardens as surpassing anything in Europe. The Spaniards did not at first grasp how much of this abundance came not from naturally fertile land, but from human ingenuity and relentless upkeep. Over centuries, the Chinampa system shaped not only the Aztec economy, but also its ecology. The construction of so many artificial islands expanded wetland habitat for birds and fish, altered water flow, and created microclimates. It was an engineered landscape, one that blurred the boundary between natural and man-made. But in 1500, none of this was in question for the Chinamperos poling between plots. For them, the day's work was measured in the dredged weight of lake mud, the straightness of maize rows, and the smooth glide of the canoe through the narrow canal. What is most striking, perhaps, is how quiet this labor must have been, a soundscape of water lapping, poles knocking softly against the canoe's rim, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Yet in that quiet was the heartbeat of an empire. The city on the lake would not have thrived without these humble rectangles of earth and the hands that tended them. Still, one must ask, how did such a system so productive, so sustainable begin in the first place, and who decided that gardens could be built upon water? If you were to travel backward from the bustling Tenochtitlan of 1500, the origins of the Chinampa system would be found in a series of quiet, practical experiments. These experiments were not recorded as grand events. They were the slow accumulation of knowledge by farmers who observed the patterns of lake, soil, and plant. The Valley of Mexico's Lakes Xochimilco, Chalco, Texcoco, Zumpango, and Zoltacan each had different salinity and depths. The southern lakes, Xochimilco and Chalco, were fresh and relatively stable, fed by springs. It was here, in these shallower and less brackish waters, that Chinampas first emerged. The concept may have started as a simple mud platform. A farmer, finding a patch of reeds and sedges growing thickly in shallow water, might have cut the plants back, added a little dredged sediment, and planted seeds. When this worked, the method could be repeated, expanded, and formalized. Over generations, such informal gardens evolved into the elaborate, rectangular, canal-bound Chinampas that we picture today. Archaeological evidence suggests that Chinampa-like agriculture predates the Aztec Empire by centuries, possibly 1,000 years or more. The Xochimilco people, one of the many Nahua-speaking groups, are often credited as early specialists in this craft. By the time the Mexica, later called the Aztecs, rose to power in the 14th century, they inherited not just the technique, but a cultural and political structure around it. Land and power. Chinampas were more than just farmland, they were units of political economy. In the Aztec world, land belonged collectively to the Calpulli, which assigned parcels to families for cultivation. While you might tend a plot year after year, your rights came from your membership in the group, not individual ownership. Tribute to the empire was calculated in goods, and Chinampa yields were an important part of meeting these obligations. Local leaders monitored production, coordinated maintenance of canals, and resolved disputes. This was essential because Chinampas depended on an interconnected water system. If one farmer blocked a canal or neglected to dredge, the effects could ripple through the community. In a sense, the farmers were not simply working their own plots, they were co-managers of a shared hydraulic landscape. Daily labor in detail. Imagine the start of a workday in early spring. Before sunrise, the Chinampero pushes his canoe into the misted water. His pole, carved from a straight sapling, bites into the lakebed as he propels the boat toward his Chinampa. He carries a flat-bladed tool for cutting weeds, a small digging stick, and woven baskets for seedlings. He might first check the reed wall, replacing any decayed sections to keep the soil from slumping into the canal. Then he climbs onto the Chinampa, the damp soil cool beneath his sandals. Kneeling, he scoops up lake mud in handfuls, spreading it around maize stalks. The mud, rich in nutrients, darkens the soil. Between the maize rows, beans twine upward, while squash vines sprawl across the ground, shading it from the sun and reducing evaporation. Such intercropping, the famous Three Sisters combination, was not accidental. It was a deeply observed practice, refined to match the Chinampa environment. The maize provided a stalk for beans to climb. Beans fixed nitrogen into the soil. Squash leaves protected the earth from drying and discouraged weeds. During the hotter months, the Chinampero might paddle into the canal to pull water plants that threatened to clog it. These plants could be composted into the Chinampa's soil or used to feed animals. Waterbirds were both a nuisance and a resource. They might nibble tender shoots, but they also provided eggs, feathers, and meat. The ecological web. A Chinampa was not isolated from the surrounding lake ecology. The canals served as fish habitat, and farmers often set small traps for species like carp and axolotl. Amphibians thrived here, and dragonflies danced over the water in summer. Willows at the edges offered shade and prevented erosion, while also serving as windbreaks for tender plants. The boundaries between farm and wild were blurred. Many plants that sprang up without planting sedges, wild amaranth and various herbs were gathered as supplementary food or for medicinal use. The lake itself acted as a temperature buffer. On chilly nights, the water kept frost from settling too heavily on the Chinampas. On hot days, evaporation cooled the air slightly. Markets and movement. The Chinampas, produce traveled by canoe to the great markets, the most famous being Tlatelolco. The journey might take an hour or two, pawing through the canals that led toward the center of Tenochtitlan. The markets were a vital part of the Chinampa economy. There, goods were exchanged not only for currency in cacao beans or cotton cloth, but also through barter. Flowers from Chinampas were prized for rituals and decoration, while surplus vegetables could be traded for obsidian tools or woven mats. Market activity also reinforced social networks. Families arranged marriages, settled disputes, and exchanged news alongside their buying and selling. It was in these markets that the empire's diversity was most visible. Goods and people from hundreds of kilometers away converged, but the humble produce from Chinampas was always in demand. A fragile mastery. Despite their productivity, Chinampas were not invulnerable. Floods could overwhelm them, especially if heavy rains swelled the lakes beyond their usual limits. Drought, though less common in the southern lakes, could still lower water levels enough to disrupt irrigation. In such times, the community might rally to dredge deeper channels or reinforce dikes. The Aztecs constructed major hydraulic works including the dike of Nezahualcóyotl to help separate the fresh southern lakes from the saltier northern waters. The maintenance of these systems was a constant obligation, binding the fates of many towns together. Spanish encounter. When the Spanish arrived, the Chinampas struck them as marvels of agricultural ingenuity, yet they quickly saw their potential for imperial tribute. The colonial period brought both continuity and disruption. Some Chinampas remained productive, supplying Spanish Mexico City, while others were abandoned as disease, displacement, and new land use patterns took hold. Over time, the drainage of lakes for urban expansion shrank the Chinampa zones drastically. Still, in the early years of Spanish rule, the Chinamperos continued their dawn routines, their poles dipping into the canals just as they had for generations. The system persisted because it was not only a way to farm, but a way of life, one embedded in the rhythms of water and soil. And yet, even in its heyday, the Chinampa system depended on a delicate balance. It relied on the cooperation of many, the stability of the lakes, and the seasonal predictability of the climate. What would happen, one might wonder, if that balance were suddenly broken? The balance that sustained the Chinampa system was not an abstract idea, it was a tangible, everyday reality for the people who worked these plots. Yet history shows that even the most efficient and well-adapted systems can be undone by forces beyond the control of those who depend on them. The first disruptions. In 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan brought devastation not only to the city, but to its surrounding agricultural lands. Canals were blocked, reed walls were torn apart, and many Chinampas lay abandoned as their caretakers were killed, enslaved, or displaced. The Spanish conquest did not just change political leadership. It disrupted the complex human and environmental web that kept the floating gardens thriving. The Spaniards, unfamiliar with the subtleties of lake agriculture, initially saw the Chinampas as curiosities rather than central infrastructure. Some were repurposed to grow old-world crops, wheat, barley, and European vegetables with mixed results. Others were allowed to fall into disrepair, as new land grants shifted priorities toward dryland ranching and haciendas. Yet the Chinampas persisted in pockets, especially around Xochimilco and Chalco, where indigenous farmers continued their traditions. These areas became important suppliers of fresh produce for colonial Mexico City, which now sprawled over much of the old lake bed. Even as large-scale drainage projects began to lower water levels, the canals in these southern districts remained navigable for centuries. The long decline. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the colonial government embarked on increasingly ambitious drainage schemes to control flooding in Mexico City. The Huehuetoca Canal and later the Grand Drainage Canal diverted water away from the valley entirely. These works protected the growing urban population from floods, but at the cost of the lake system's integrity. As the water receded, Chinampas lost their constant irrigation source. Some were converted into conventional fields, but their fertility diminished without the steady supply of nutrient-rich sediment. Others simply dried out, their reed walls collapsing into the dust. The decline was gradual, often invisible to those not working the land, a narrowing of canals here, a loss of willows there, until the patchwork of green and blue became more muted. Survival through adaptation. Still, the Chinampa tradition proved resilient. In Xochimilco, indigenous communities adapted by digging wells and constructing small reservoirs to supplement the shrinking canals. They diversified their crops, adding more flowers, marigolds, dahlias, roses, which fetched higher prices in urban markets. These ornamental crops required less water than maize and could be sold for festivals and religious celebrations. The social structure also adapted. While the old cowpally system had faded, cooperative labor arrangements persisted. Families might pool resources to repair a shared canal, just as their ancestors had done. Canoes still glided between the plots, though now they carried not only produce but also manure from the city to fertilize the beds, a reversal of the ancient flow of nutrients from lake to land. The 20th century challenge. By the mid-20th century, the pressure of urban growth became the greatest threat. Mexico City's population exploded, and its boundaries crept southward into Chinampa country. Canals were filled in to make roads. New housing developments replaced old garden plots. Pollution from untreated sewage and industrial runoff choked what water remained. Yet amid this, the Chinampas did not disappear entirely. Some farmers modernized their operations, installing pumps, greenhouses, and plastic sheeting. Others sought recognition for Chinampas as a cultural heritage worth preserving. In 1987, UNESCO designated Xochimilco as a World Heritage Site, citing its unique agricultural system and historical significance. Echoes of the past. Today, the Chinampas of Xochimilco are a fraction of their former extent, but they still function much as they did centuries ago. A visitor can take a brightly painted traginera, a flat-bottomed boat along the canals, passing plots dense with lettuce, spinach, herbs, and flowers. Beneath the tourist activity, some families maintain deep knowledge of soil care, crop rotation, and canal management that traces directly back to pre-Hispanic times. Modern advocates point to Chinampas as a model for sustainable agriculture. They produce high yields without synthetic fertilizers, conserve water, and integrate with wetland ecosystems. In an era of climate uncertainty, their lessons seem newly relevant. Use local resources efficiently, maintain biodiversity, and design farming systems that work with natural cycles rather than against them. Reflection. The story of the Chinampas is not one of a sudden rise and fall, but of persistence under pressure. It is the story of how human ingenuity shaped a landscape to feed an empire, and how that landscape, in turn, shaped the culture and rhythms of its people. It is also a cautionary tale about how easily such delicate systems can be damaged when the balance between human need and environmental capacity is ignored. Standing on the edge of a canal in Xochimilco today, you might see a farmer poling a canoe much like his ancestors did 500 years ago. The air might still carry the smell of damp earth, the rustle of willows, the splash of waterfowl. But behind the tranquility lies a history of adaptation, resilience, and loss, a reminder that even the most boring, details of daily life can hold the key to a civilization's survival. And perhaps the most lingering question is this. If the Chinampa system could sustain one of the largest cities of its time with such elegance and efficiency, why has the modern world been so reluctant to embrace its lessons? Story 2. The Endless Watch Lighthouse Keepers of the 19th Century, North Atlantic. Picture yourself in the year 1873, on a rocky outcrop somewhere along the ragged coast of Nova Scotia. The sea here is not the warm blue of postcards, but a cold, shifting gray-green, streaked with foam. Wind lashes your face, and the smell of salt and kelp clings to your clothes. Waves crash against the rock with the same steady violence they have for centuries. Somewhere beyond the horizon, steamships and schooners carry cargo and passengers through these dangerous waters. Without the guidance of your light, many would never make landfall. This is the world of the 19th century lighthouse keeper, a life defined by routine, vigilance, and isolation. The keeper's main duty was simple in principle: keep the light burning, night after night, no matter the weather. In practice, it required an endless sequence of tasks, each essential to preventing disaster. A day in the life. Your day begins before dawn, though the light has burned through the night. The first job is to extinguish it once the sky is bright enough for mariners to navigate without it. In the mid-19th century, many North Atlantic lighthouses used Fresnel lenses, a French invention that concentrated the light into a powerful beam visible for many miles. The lamp itself was fueled by whale oil early in the century, later replaced by kerosene as whaling declined and petroleum became more widely available. After extinguishing the lamp, you inspect the lens. Glass attracts soot, salt, and insect corpses, all of which can dim the beam's reach. You wipe it with a chamois cloth, careful not to scratch the delicate concentric prisms. Even a tiny chip could scatter the light and weaken its power. The lens must remain spotless in thick fog or heavy rain. The difference between a sharp beam and a diffused glow could be the difference between life and death for a ship. Next comes the cleaning of the lamp's mechanical parts. If your lighthouse has a clockwork rotation system, you wind it, ensuring the lens turns at the correct speed to create its unique flash pattern. Mariners relied on these patterns to identify specific lights on the coast. One might flash twice every 15 seconds. Another might have a long flash followed by two short ones. Your lighthouse's signature was a matter of pride and precision. Weather and records. The keeper's duties extended beyond tending the light. You were also the local meteorologist. The lighthouse service required daily records of temperature, wind speed, barometric pressure, and sea conditions. Your notes, written in careful script in a leather-bound logbook, might be read days or weeks later by officials in distant cities. These weather records, though perhaps dull in their repetition, were vital for navigation and for the growing science of meteorology. You might note, for example, wind NE force 6, seas heavy, visibility poor, snow squalls. One schooner sighted heading south, sails reefed. Such entries provided both a record of your vigilance and a chronicle of the sea's changing moods. Isolation and supplies. Life as a lighthouse keeper meant isolation. Many North Atlantic stations were on islands, reachable only by boat in fair weather. Provisions, flour, salted meat, beans, lamp oil, spare wicks arrived once every few weeks, sometimes longer in winter. If storms closed in, you might have to ration supplies carefully. The keeper's family, if present, shared in the work. A wife might keep the household, tend a small garden, mend clothes, and help polish the lens. Children fetched water, carried coal, and assisted in emergency repairs. In some stations, especially those on remote rocks with no arable land, life was a constant exercise in resourcefulness. The watch. As evening approaches, you trim the lamp's wick, refill its oil reservoir, and light it just as the sun dips below the horizon. You check the rotation mechanism again, listening for any irregular clicking that might signal trouble. In stormy weather, you might remain awake for much of the night, climbing the spiral staircase repeatedly to ensure the light burned steadily. The view from the lantern room at night is at once majestic and oppressive. The beam sweeps across the black water, briefly illuminating the foam on wave crests. Beyond the reach of your light, darkness is absolute. The rhythmic sound of the mechanism turning the lens becomes part of your thoughts, as steady as your own breathing. On clear nights, you might glimpse the lights of a passing ship, tiny pinpricks on the horizon. You know that your light is just as small in their eyes, but without it, they would have no reference at all. The fog problem. Fog was the keeper's greatest enemy. In thick fog, the light's beam could be swallowed entirely within a few hundred meters. To compensate, lighthouses along the North Atlantic began to install fog signals, bells, whistles, or cannons fired at regular intervals. By the late 19th century, steam-powered foghorns became the standard. Operating a foghorn was noisy, exhausting work. In fog lasting for days, you might have to keep the machinery running continuously, checking the boiler, adding coal, and timing each blast to maintain the prescribed interval. The sound carried far over the water, a low, mournful tone that mariners came to recognize as a warning of hidden danger. Quiet dangers. The work might seem monotonous, but danger was never far. Slippery steps in the lantern room could send you falling. A storm wave could swamp a small landing boat. A slip with a chisel while repairing the mechanism could cripple your hand. Medical help was often days away. There were also the less visible risks, the toll of solitude, the strain of constant readiness, and the way the sea's endless motion seemed to seep into your bones. Some keepers spoke of hearing phantom bells or voices in the wind after long periods without visitors. Others found solace in the predictability of their duties, a bulwark against the chaos of the ocean beyond. An unbroken line of light. Through all of this, the light remained constant. Ships came and went, storms raged and passed, seasons turned, but the keeper's task never changed. This unbroken chain of vigilance connected you to every keeper before you and everyone who would follow. But in an age when steam power was advancing and telegraph lines were stretching across continents, one had to wonder, how long could such a solitary, manual profession endure before automation replaced the human watch? If the first section showed you the lighthouse keeper's daily cycle, this one draws you deeper into the infrastructure, the networks, and the quiet politics of the 19th century North Atlantic light system, a web of duty that stretched far beyond any single rocky station. A network of lights. By the 1870s, the North Atlantic coastline from the icy shores of Newfoundland down through Nova Scotia, New England, and beyond was studded with lights of varying size and purpose. Some were towering masonry beacons visible for 20 miles. Others were short, squat lights on harbor entrances, their beams reaching only a few miles offshore. Each had its own flash pattern, recorded in Admiralty lists or the United States Lighthouse Board's light lists. These documents were essential for mariners, as precise as any map. Keepers knew the other lights near them by reputation, if not in person. They might never visit the tower 60 miles down the coast, but they understood its range, its fuel type, and its maintenance schedule. The idea was that no stretch of hazardous water should be left unguarded. A ship leaving Halifax bound for Boston could sail by night, always catching the next light on the horizon before the last one faded. The bureaucracy of vigilance. The Lighthouse Board or Service oversaw these stations, sending inspectors on scheduled and surprise visits. An inspector's arrival was a tense moment. They examined the lens for dust, checked oil supplies, and read through the keeper's logbook. Entries had to be precise: weather data, light operation times, ship sightings, and any mechanical issues. An inspector finding carelessness, an untrimmed wick, a misaligned lens could issue a formal reprimand or even recommend dismissal. Pay was modest, but the position carried a certain dignity. In remote fishing towns, the lighthouse keeper was often regarded as a figure of trust, someone who literally safeguarded lives. The role required literacy, mechanical aptitude, and a tolerance for solitude, which meant not everyone was suited for it. Supply runs and coordination. Resupply was a logistical dance. The lighthouse tender, a sturdy vessel operated by the service, made regular circuits along the coast, bringing barrels of kerosene, crates of food, spare wicks, and replacement glass. These tenders also carried mail, official orders, and sometimes visiting mechanics for larger repairs. When storms delayed the tender, keepers relied on reserves. Every drop of lamp oil was measured and logged. Every repair was stretched as far as it could go. At stations with gardens, fresh produce supplemented the standard rations. In summer, this meant greens, root vegetables, and maybe a chicken or two. In winter, it meant salted fish and hardtack unless the tender could get through. Weather and the keeper's science. The meteorological observations keepers recorded were more than bureaucratic routine. Over decades, these records built a picture of the region's seasonal hazards: the frequency of nor'easters, the onset of the autumn gales, the likelihood of fog in early summer. Mariners learned to trust not only the light's position, but the implied knowledge behind it. If a certain keeper reported visibility poor, wind essay, captains would know to adjust course long before reaching those waters. Some keepers took pride in being amateur forecasters. They read the sky, noting the halo around the moon or the sudden drop of a barometer. They understood the smell of the air before a storm, the way the sea seemed to breathe differently when wind was shifting. While science advanced, much of this knowledge remained rooted in lived experience. Isolation as a constant companion. Isolation defined the job as much as the technical duties. A mainland lighthouse within sight of a village was one thing. A wave-swept tower on a reef 15 miles from shore was another. For the latter, visits from the outside world could be weeks apart. Keepers in these extreme stations often formed small crews, 2 or 3 men rotating duties to avoid exhaustion. Even so, the sameness of the surroundings could wear on the mind. Letters from remote keepers sometimes spoke of the comfort of routine, but others hinted at strain. One might mention the relief of hearing the tender's whistle after weeks of nothing but the crash of waves. Another might note how the silence at night was so deep that the ticking of the clockwork lens seemed louder than the sea. The fog signal era. By the late 19th century, fog signals were becoming more standardized, and the role of the keeper expanded again. In some stations, running the foghorn was almost as demanding as tending the light. Steam-powered signals required constant feeding of the boiler, careful timing of each blast, and regular maintenance to prevent breakdown. The horn's low, mournful note would carry across the water, repeating every minute or so, a monotonous soundtrack that could continue for days. For ships, this sound was a reassurance. For keepers, it was both comfort and fatigue. Some claimed they could still hear the horn even after the fog cleared, the sound lodged in their minds. Lives intertwined with the light. The lighthouse was more than a job post. It was a home. Children grew up learning to polish brass fittings, carry oil cans, and watch for approaching vessels. Wives often served as unofficial assistant keepers, taking the watch when their husbands fell ill or were called away. In rare cases, women became the official keepers themselves, often after a husband's death, their skill proven long before the title was granted. The station itself had to be kept in order. Living quarters clean, stores inventoried, paths shoveled in winter, paint touched up on the tower to keep the sea air from corroding the masonry. Even the smallest neglect could lead to bigger problems later. The encroaching age of technology. By the 1880s and 1890s, automation was beginning to creep in. Clockwork systems could run longer without human intervention, fuel efficiency improved, and lightships floating lighthouses anchored offshore offered flexibility in covering dangerous shoals. Telegraph lines connected some stations to mainland offices, reducing the isolation slightly. Yet even as these changes arrived, the human element remained irreplaceable. Machines could fail, Storms could damage the lantern room, and there was no substitute for a keeper's judgment when something unexpected appeared on the horizon. But one could not help but wonder, when would the march of technology finally render the keeper obsolete, and what would be lost when no human eye watched the sea from the tower? The lighthouse keeper's life was already one of discipline and solitude, but as the century closed, change loomed on the horizon. The transition from a purely human watch to mechanical and eventually automated systems did not happen all at once. It was a gradual process, full of half measures and experiments. The coming of electricity. By the late 19th century, electricity was beginning to appear in urban centers, and the lighthouse service experimented with electric arc lamps in a few high-profile stations. These lights were brighter and could reach farther than oil lamps, but they were also temperamental and required generators, which in turn needed trained operators and constant maintenance. In the remote stations of the North Atlantic, this meant that keepers became, in effect, early electrical engineers. They learned to tend dynamos, inspect wiring, and troubleshoot malfunctions in foul weather. While these new systems still required round-the-clock attention, they hinted at a future where human presence might be less essential. Heroism in the shadows. Despite their quiet work, lighthouse keepers occasionally found themselves at the center of dramatic rescues. Ships still wrecked on hidden shoals or ran aground in storms, and in such moments, the keeper's role expanded beyond tending the light. A keeper might row out in high seas to pull survivors from a capsized vessel, or lower a rope ladder to men clinging to the rocks below. Many such acts went unrecorded except in the local logbooks, noted in the same plain tone used for weather entries. Assisted in rescue of 6 men from the schooner Mary Ellen, 1 deceased. The understatement masked the danger and the courage involved. In these moments, the keeper's connection to the mariners was direct and human, not abstract. The light was not just a navigational aid. It was a promise that someone was watching, even in the darkest hours. Endurance and routine. In calmer times, the work returned to its steady cycle. Oil cans were refilled, brass was polished, and logbooks were updated with the same quiet precision as always. The predictability could be a comfort, insulating the keeper from the chaos of the outside world. Yet for some, the routine became a weight, the sense that one was tethered to the same patch of rock for years or decades, watching ships pass but never traveling oneself. There was a certain melancholy to this, but also a kind of pride. The keeper's constancy was measured not in personal adventures, but in the unbroken operation of the light. Every ship that passed safely was a quiet victory, even if the crew never knew who kept the lens turning. The end of the unbroken watch. By the early 20th century, technological advances accelerated. Acetylene gas lights with sun valves devices that automatically turned the light on at dusk and off at dawn began to appear in smaller stations. These innovations reduced the need for a constant human presence. In some places, keepers were reassigned or their posts left vacant, the buildings locked and shuttered. In larger stations, the human watch endured longer, especially where fog signals or complex machinery required oversight. But the trend was clear. The age of the solitary keeper was waning. By the mid-20th century, full automation became increasingly common, and the once essential human figure at the top of the tower became a rarity. Legacy on the coast. Today, many of the North Atlantic's lighthouses still stand, though few are staffed. Some have been converted into museums, others into private residences or tourist attractions. A handful still operate as aids to navigation, their lights automated but their presence a reminder of the human labor that once kept the sea lanes safe. The keepers themselves left behind logbooks, photographs, and sometimes memoirs. These records show not only the mechanics of lighthouse work, but also the texture of life at the edge of the sea. The smell of burning oil, the creak of wooden stairs in a storm, the sound of the foghorn echoing through the mist. Reflection. The 19th century lighthouse keeper's story is one of endurance, not just physical, but mental and emotional. It is about maintaining vigilance in a place where nothing happens for weeks, until suddenly everything depends on you. It is about understanding that your work is measured not in applause or recognition, but in the absence of disaster. When the last human keepers left their stations, they took with them a skill set and a way of life that technology cannot quite replace. The ability to read the sea, to judge a storm's approach by the sound of the wind, to keep a light burning through sheer will when machinery fails. And so the question remains, when we entrust the watch entirely to machines, what happens to the subtle human judgment that once stood between safety and catastrophe? Story 3. Measuring Shadows: The Long Life of the Egyptian Nilometer. It is dawn on the Nile, somewhere near Cairo, in the year 950 CE. The river glows bronze in the early light, broad and slow, carrying with it the silt of thousands of miles of upstream travel. You can smell the damp mud along the banks, hear the distant lowing of cattle, and see the first farmers stepping into their fields. But here, on the southern tip of Rhoda Island, a small crowd is gathered not to work the fields, but to watch a man descend a narrow stone stairway into the river itself. He carries a staff and wears plain linen. His role is not to farm the land, but to read the river. This place is the site of a Nilometer, a structure built to measure the height of the Nile's annual flood. The man is a Mikia's official, tasked with taking the first reading of the day. His measurements will ripple outward into the entire Egyptian economy, determining the year's taxes, the allocation of grain, and even the stability of the ruler's reign. The Nile's flood in Egypt's life. To understand the Nilometer, you must understand the ancient rhythm of the Nile itself. Each year, rains in the Ethiopian highlands swelled the Blue Nile and Atbara rivers, sending a surge of water northward into Egypt. By midsummer, the river began to rise, peaking between August and September and slowly receding by October. This flood was both a blessing and a risk. Too little water meant famine. Too much meant destruction of dikes, villages, and fields. The sweet spot was narrow. A rise of about 16 cubits, roughly 8 meters, at Cairo meant ideal conditions. The Nilometer allowed officials to track this rise precisely and predict the year's prospects. Anatomy of a Nilometer. The Rhoda Island Nilometer, built in 861 CE under the Abbasid Caliph al-Mutawakkil, was a marvel of practical architecture. A stone-lined well was connected to the river by channels, allowing water to flow in as the Nile rose. Inside the well, a central marble column stood, carved with markings in cubits and subdivided into fingers. The column was anchored to the base and rose vertically, a fixed ruler against which the water level could be read. A spiral staircase hugged the inside wall, descending to the base so officials could walk down and take measurements at any level. Light streamed in from an octagonal dome above, illuminating the cool, damp interior. The walls often carried inscriptions in Kufic script, noting repairs, rulers, names, or dedications. The reading. Each morning during the flood season, the appointed official descended the stairs and noted where the water met the column's markings. The result was immediately reported to government offices in medieval Cairo. This meant couriers carried the reading to the vizier's bureau, where it was recorded and compared with previous days' measurements. If the flood was progressing well, word spread quickly, and markets responded with optimism. Grain merchants adjusted prices, farmers prepared their fields, and tax collectors planned their campaigns. If the reading showed a poor rise, anxiety spread just as fast. Even in the age before telegraphs, the Nilometer's daily report could influence decisions across hundreds of kilometers. Ancient precedent. The Abbasid Nilometer was not the first. Egyptians had been measuring the Nile for at least 3,000 years before that. Nilometers of various designs, stepped, column, and corridor types existed in temples from Elephantine in the south to Memphis in the north. The oldest known example, at the Temple of Khnum on Elephantine Island, dates back to the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, c. 1800 BCE. In pharaonic times, the readings were tied to religious authority. Priests interpreted the river's height as a sign from the gods, especially Hapi, the god of the inundation. Festivals accompanied the flood's arrival, blending practical measurements with sacred ritual. The nilometer thus occupied a space between science, administration, and religion. The science of flood forecasting. While the nilometer gave direct data on water height, forecasting the flood size began far upstream. Observations in Nubia and Ethiopia could give hints weeks before the surge reached Egypt. Over centuries, Egyptian officials correlated Ethiopian rainfall with Nile heights, building a long-term understanding of the system. By the medieval period, these observations became part of a bureaucratic science. Court astronomers and geographers combined flood data with celestial calculations, attempting to refine predictions. Some believed the position of certain stars heralded strong or weak floods. Others relied entirely on the nilometer's cold, objective stone. Social and political impact. The nilometer's readings were more than technical data, they were levers of power. Under both pharaonic and Islamic rule, tax assessments depended on the size of the flood. A bountiful inundation meant higher taxes, justified by the expectation of abundant harvests. A poor flood could lead to tax relief, or, in harsher regimes, no relief at all, simply driving farmers into debt. This connection meant that tampering with nilometer readings was a potential act of political sabotage. In some periods, officials accused rivals of manipulating results to influence public mood or discredit a ruler. As a result, access to the nilometer was strictly controlled. The appointed measurer's role was both technical and political, and the penalty for falsifying a reading could be severe. The human element. Imagine being that measurer on a day when the flood's height was disappointing. You descend into the cool shadows of the well, your hand on the smooth, damp stone of the stair rail. The water laps softly against the base of the column, but you can see at once it is far lower than it should be for mid-August. You know what this means: harder lives for farmers, higher grain prices, and possibly famine. You take the reading anyway, ink it into the ledger, and seal the report. As you emerge into the sunlight, the small crowd waiting by the entrance searches your face for a sign. You give none. The reading will speak for itself once it reaches the vizier. Longevity of a tool. The remarkable thing is that this basic system, a fixed scale against which the river is measured, remained essentially unchanged for millennia. Dynasties rose and fell, religions shifted, capitals moved, but as long as Egypt depended on the Nile's flood, the nilometer remained indispensable. And yet one must ask, if such a simple tool was so effective for so long, what finally made it obsolete? If Section 1 set the scene for the nilometer's purpose and origins, we now step into the long, layered history that kept it in use for centuries, and the shifts in politics, religion, and environment that altered its role without diminishing its importance. The nilometer and religious authority. For much of its history, the nilometer was more than a hydrological instrument. It was a sacred object. In pharaonic times, its measurements were intertwined with the worship of Hapi, the Nile god, and Khnum, the divine potter who fashioned human beings and controlled the river's flow. Priests read the flood level as a sign of divine favor or displeasure, and annual ceremonies thanked the gods for the inundation. Even after Egypt's conversion to Christianity and later to Islam, the flood retained religious overtones. Under Islamic rule, the nilometer's readings were announced from the pulpits of mosques, and public festivals were tied to the opening of the canals, the ceremonial moment when water from the inundated river was allowed to flow into the irrigation channels. One of the largest such festivals was the Wafa al-Nil, the fidelity of the Nile, which continued into modern times as a celebration of the river's life-giving power. Crowds gathered along the banks, music and food stalls appeared, and the official nilometer reading was eagerly awaited. Engineering and upkeep. The Rhode Island nilometer, the best preserved example, required constant maintenance. The channels connecting it to the Nile could silt up, cutting off the water flow. Stone steps eroded under the constant dampness, and the markings on the central column had to be recarved over time to remain legible. Repairs were recorded in inscriptions, some noting caliphs who sponsored renovations, others marking years of extraordinary floods. In this way, the nilometer became a kind of stone chronicle, quietly keeping the record of centuries of rulers and river cycles. Upkeep was a shared responsibility. Skilled masons, laborers, and government-appointed engineers collaborated to keep the structure in working order. The work was not glamorous, but without it, the annual flood measurement and the economy dependent on it could not function. The role in taxation and administration. The nilometer's readings directly influenced Egypt's taxation system for most of its history. Under the Abbasids, a flood of 16 cubits was considered optimal. A higher or lower reading triggered adjustments in grain taxes. Tax officials depended on these measurements to forecast crop yields months in advance. Since the harvest came long after the flood receded, early knowledge of expected yields allowed the government to set quotas and plan for surplus storage or importation in poor years. For farmers, the nilometer was both a blessing and a source of anxiety. A high reading promised a good harvest but also higher taxes. A low reading might bring tax relief but also hunger. In some years, the government used stored grain to stabilize prices, but in others, corruption or mismanagement turned low floods into crises. Political tensions around the reading. Because the nilometer was so central to governance, its measurements could be politically charged. Rumors occasionally spread that readings had been altered to suit a ruler's agenda, perhaps to justify higher taxes, or to conceal the severity of a poor flood year from the public. This possibility made the role of the official measurer especially sensitive. He had to be a trusted figure, often with religious or administrative training, and his work was sometimes witnessed by other officials to ensure accuracy. In Cairo, the announcement of a particularly high or low reading could spark immediate reactions in the markets. Grain prices could shift within hours. Merchants listened as closely to the nilometer's daily report as modern traders watch financial tickers. Measuring in times of crisis. The nilometer's importance was especially clear in times of drought or excessive flood. In the 11th century, during the Fatimid dynasty, a series of poor floods contributed to the devastating Great Famine of 1065–1072. Contemporary chronicles describe starvation in Cairo, with bread prices rising beyond the reach of ordinary people. The nilometer's low readings during these years became grim markers of the crisis. In contrast, excessive floods could destroy dikes and wash away villages. The nilometer could not prevent these disasters, but it could provide advance warning, giving communities time to shore up defenses. The human scale of measurement. Imagine standing in the nilometer well at the peak of the flood, the water lapping just below the high markings on the column. The air is heavy with humidity, the sound of the river echoing off the stone walls. You place your hand on the smooth marble, feeling the ancient incised lines beneath your fingers, the same lines your predecessors have read for centuries. You climb the spiral staircase, emerging into bright sunlight. Outside, the city hums with activity, donkeys carrying sacks of grain, children chasing each other along the riverbank, fishermen mending nets. All of it the city's survival, the farmers' fortunes. The stability of the government depends in part on the reading you just made. Continuity and chain. From the Old Kingdom through the Abbasid Caliphate, the basic principle of the nilometer remained unchanged. A fixed scale, a daily reading, a connection between water height and agricultural planning. This continuity is remarkable, given the political upheavals Egypt endured over 3,000 years. But in the centuries after the Abbasids, new forces began to change the way Egypt managed its water. Canals were expanded, dams constructed, and eventually, in the 20th century, the Nile's flow was radically altered by large-scale engineering projects. Even as these changes took hold, the Nilometer continued to operate partly as a functioning tool, partly as a symbol of Egypt's deep connection to its river. But the day was coming when its readings would no longer dictate the rhythm of the nation's life. If the Nilometer could survive pharaohs, caliphs, and centuries of floods, what could finally end its practical role? By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Egypt's relationship with the Nile was entering an entirely new phase. The rhythm that had sustained the Nilometer for millennia, the rise and fall of the annual flood, was about to be reshaped by industrial engineering and modern politics. The Aswan Low Dam and the beginning of the end. In 1902, the Aswan Low Dam was completed. For the first time in history, Egypt could partially regulate the flow of the Nile. The dam's purpose was not to stop the flood entirely, but to store water for use in the dry season, enabling perennial irrigation. This was a radical departure from the ancient system, in which agriculture depended on the natural flood and recede cycle. The dam's construction meant that the flood's height at Cairo became less predictable in its old patterns. Water levels could now be adjusted upstream, blurring the link between the natural Ethiopian rains and the river's rise in Egypt. The Nilometer's measurements were still taken, but their direct correlation with agricultural output began to weaken. Modern hydrology replaces the ancient gauge. By the mid-20th century, modern hydrological stations equipped with mechanical gauges and remote telemetry were spreading along the Nile. These instruments could record water flow, sediment content, and evaporation rates with precision that the Nilometer's stone column could never match. Engineers now monitored the river from multiple points, not just a single structure in Cairo. Decision-making shifted from the Mikia's official reading the column to a network of government agencies using scientific instruments, rainfall data from Ethiopia, and seasonal forecasts. Still, for decades, the Nilometer continued to function as a ceremonial marker. During the annual Wafa al-Nil festival, the reading was announced as it had been for centuries, even if modern planners had already calculated the year's irrigation schedules without it. The high dam and the end of the flood cycle. The decisive break came in 1970, when the Aswan High Dam was completed. Its massive reservoir, Lake Nasser, effectively ended the natural annual flood. The Nile's flow at Cairo became regulated year-round, the dramatic seasonal rise and fall that had defined Egyptian life for millennia was gone. Without the flood, the Nilometer no longer served its original purpose. Water levels still changed slightly with seasonal use patterns, but the link to agricultural fertility was severed. The ancient 16-cubit ideal flood became a historical curiosity rather than a living standard. Preservation as heritage. Today, the Rhoda Island Nilometer survives as a historical monument. Tourists can descend the spiral staircase, see the marble column rising from the water, and imagine the officials of centuries past making their readings. Inscriptions on the walls record rulers from the Abbasid caliphs to later Mamluk sultans, each marking their role in preserving the structure. The Nilometer's continued existence offers a tangible connection to the deep past, a reminder that Egypt's agricultural and political systems were once so closely tied to a simple yet precise measurement of water. Lessons from a long-lived tool. The Nilometer's story is remarkable not because it was technologically advanced, its principle is almost primitive, but because it was perfectly suited to its environment and needs. For over 3,000 years, it provided the data on which an entire civilization depended. Its endurance raises questions about the relationship between simplicity and resilience. While modern systems offer greater precision, they are also more complex and dependent on technology that requires specialized maintenance. The nilometer, by contrast, could be read by anyone trained to count cubits and note a water line. The end of the annual inundations culture. The loss of the flood did not just end the nilometer's use, it altered Egypt's cultural rhythm. Festivals tied to the flood's arrival faded or transformed. Farmers no longer planned planting and harvesting in sync with the river's natural rise. The symbolic link between water level and prosperity, so deeply ingrained in Egyptian consciousness, became part of history. Some lament this change as the passing of an era when human life was more in tune with natural cycles. Others note that the dam brought stability, reduced famine risk, and allowed year-round cultivation. The trade-off is undeniable. Control has replaced uncertainty, but also the deep seasonal connection to the Nile that defined Egyptian life for thousands of years. Reflection. The Nilometer's marble column still stands in the cool, shadowed chamber on Rhoda Island, the marks of cubits and fingers still visible to anyone who leans over the railing. Its water still rises and falls with the river, but those movements are no longer the heartbeat of a nation. It is now a relic that once decided tax rates, predicted famine, and linked the fate of millions to the invisible rains falling in distant highlands. In its quiet survival, it whispers a question that reaches far beyond Egypt. In our drive to control nature completely, what wisdom might we lose from the simple act of watching it carefully, year after year, for 1,000 years? Story 4. Salt and Stone, the monastic salt harvesters of medieval France. The year is 1248, and you are standing on the windswept Atlantic coast of France, near the Bay of Bergneuf. The tide has just begun to retreat, revealing a vast expanse of shimmering flats. Shallow pools glint in the afternoon sun, separated by low, muddy embankments. In the distance, a small group of men in coarse woolen habits work silently, dragging wooden rakes through the water. These are Cistercian monks, and this is their harvest not of grain, but of salt. Salt, the medieval necessity. In the medieval world, salt was not merely a seasoning. It was a preservative, a commodity as vital as grain or iron. Without it, fish could not be kept for winter, meat would spoil quickly, and cheese could not be properly aged. For inland communities, salt was often worth its weight in silver, and access to it could mean the difference between survival and hunger in a bad year. Coastal France, especially the western regions of Brittany, Poitou, and the Vendée, had the perfect conditions for salt production. Shallow bays, abundant sunshine in summer, and strong tidal flows made it possible to evaporate seawater and leave behind pure white crystals. The technique, known as solar evaporation, required careful engineering and a great deal of patience. The monastic role in salt production. By the 12th and 13th centuries, monastic orders, particularly the Cistercians, had become deeply involved in salt making. Monasteries often received coastal lands as donations from nobles seeking spiritual favor, and these lands included valuable salt flats. The monks brought organization, record-keeping, and communal labor to what had previously been a small-scale, family-based activity. Salt production suited monastic discipline. It demanded steady, repetitive work, close attention to environmental conditions, and cooperation among many hands, all in line with the Cistercian ethos of labor as a form of prayer. Moreover, salt could be sold or traded to support the monastery's other activities, from feeding the poor to maintaining scriptoria. Anatomy of a medieval saltworks. A saltworks, or saline, was an intricate system of ponds and channels. The process began with the prize dough and intake channel that allowed seawater to flow into the system during high tide. From there, the water passed through a series of settling ponds where heavier silt and debris could sink. Next came the evaporation ponds, shallow basins where the sun and wind gradually concentrated the brine. The monks monitored salinity levels by sight and touch, nodding when the water felt heavy on the skin or when it left a slight crystalline residue on the fingers. Finally, the concentrated brine entered the crystallization ponds, or oolits. These were the heart of the operation, flat, clay-lined basins where salt crystals formed as the water evaporated. The monks raked the salt into small piles, allowing it to drain before transporting it to storage sheds. Tools and techniques. The work required specialized tools. Wooden rakes with long, flat blades to gather the salt without stirring up mud. Shovels made from hardwood to transfer salt to baskets. Wicker baskets lined with cloth to carry the harvest without losing fine grains. The timing was critical. If the salt was raked too early, it would be damp and prone to spoilage. If left too long, wind or rain could dissolve it back into the brine. The monks kept a constant watch on the weather, scanning the horizon for incoming squalls. The daily rhythm. During the summer harvest season, work began at first light. The monks processed the previous day's salt, turning it in the storage sheds to ensure even drying. Then they moved to the oolits, where they raked new crystals into neat rows. By mid-morning, the heat could be intense, the reflected light from the white salt nearly blinding. Wide-brimmed hats or hoods helped shield their eyes. At midday, they paused for a simple meal, often bread, cheese, and salted fish before returning to the ponds. The afternoon was spent maintaining embankments, clearing channels, and adjusting sluice gates. After vespers, the monks might still be found in the storage sheds, weighing and packing salt for transport. Transport and trade. Once harvested, the salt was moved by cart or boat to local markets. River transport was especially important. Barges carried salt inland along waterways like the Loire, supplying towns many days' journey from the coast. Monasteries often formed agreements with merchants, exchanging regular quantities of salt for other goods or for coin. Salt was sometimes paid as rent by tenant farmers on monastic lands. It was also used in charitable distributions, particularly during fasting seasons when preserved fish became a dietary staple. Quiet wealth and responsibility. While the Cistercians embraced poverty in their personal lives, the salt trade brought significant wealth to some monasteries. This wealth was not hoarded, at least in theory, but reinvested into the community, improving roads, building mills, funding manuscript copying, and supporting pilgrims. However, control of salt resources also carried political weight. In some regions, local lords or kings imposed taxes or claimed rights over salt production, leading to disputes with monastic orders. These conflicts were usually resolved through negotiation, but they highlight the fact that even the most seemingly peaceful industry could have strategic importance. The environmental factor. The monks were deeply attuned to their environment. They understood the interplay of tides, wind, and sun in ways that came only from years of observation. They could tell from the smell of the air whether the tide would be high enough to fill the intake channels, or whether a change in wind direction would speed or slow evaporation. Their work also shaped the landscape. Over generations, the network of ponds, dikes, and channels became a semi-artificial ecosystem, attracting wading birds and altering local vegetation. In some places, these medieval saltworks still influence the coastal ecology today. On the surface, the harvest might seem a peaceful, almost meditative task, the slow raking of crystals under the summer sun. But behind this calm lay a complex web of economics, politics, and environmental management. And one must ask, how did the monks, bound by vows of poverty and seclusion, balance their spiritual ideals with the worldly demands of running one of the most lucrative industries of their time? In the first section, we saw the rhythm and method of monastic salt harvesting in medieval France. Now we follow the salt beyond the ponds, into the networks of trade, taxation, and politics that bound the monks' quiet work to the wider medieval world. Salt and the feudal web. By the 13th century, salt production was not just a craft, it was a regulated and often contested economic resource. Coastal monasteries operated in a world where feudal rights defined who could produce, transport, and sell salt. Lords, bishops, and kings all had claims. The Cistercians' success in the salt trade rested on their ability to navigate these overlapping authorities without compromising their vows. Often, monasteries secured charters granting them the right to produce salt tax-free or to sell it within certain territories without interference. These charters were valuable and closely guarded. A lost or stolen charter could lead to years of legal disputes. In some cases, abbots traveled to royal courts to reaffirm their privileges when a new monarch took the throne. The Gabel's foreshadowing. In France, centuries later, the infamous Gabel, the royal salt tax, would become a symbol of inequality and oppression, helping fuel the French Revolution. But its roots lay in earlier medieval practices of taxing and regulating salt. In the 13th and 14th centuries, some regions already had proto-Gabel systems, tolls on salt transported along certain rivers, or mandatory purchases of salt from designated sources. The Cistercians, with their reputation for fairness and their political connections, often negotiated exemptions or favorable terms. This allowed them to keep prices competitive and maintain goodwill with local communities, while still turning a steady profit. Salt routes and distribution. From the salt flats of the Bay of Bergneuf, salt moved inland along well-established trade routes. Packhorses carried it overland to nearby towns, but for longer distances, river and coastal shipping were essential. The Loire River, for example, acted as a great salt artery, carrying the product deep into the heart of France. Inland cities such as Tours or Orléans relied heavily on coastal salt. Once there, the salt could be distributed further by cart or smaller riverboats to villages and monasteries far from the sea. The monks' meticulous record-keeping ensured that each shipment was documented: quantity, quality, price, and destination. Quality and branding. Not all salt was equal. The white, fine-grained salt from certain ponds was more prized than coarser, grayer varieties. Monastic salt often carried a reputation for purity, thanks to careful maintenance of the oolits and disciplined harvesting techniques. Buyers came to associate certain monasteries with consistently high quality and early form of brand recognition. In some cases, monasteries stamped their salt sacks with distinctive marks or symbols. These were not purely decorative. They deterred counterfeiting and reassured buyers that they were getting the genuine product. Balancing labor and prayer. Monastic life was governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized both prayer and manual labor. Salt harvesting, with its seasonal demands, had to be integrated into the daily schedule of liturgical offices. In summer, when work hours were long and the sun was strong, monks might adjust meal and prayer times to fit the tide schedule and the critical hours of evaporation. Lay brothers, members of the monastic community, who focused on manual work, rather than choir duties, often took the lead in salt production. This freed the choir monks to maintain the full liturgical routine while still contributing to the operation. The division of labor ensured that the spiritual and economic needs of the community were both met. Economic stability and social responsibility. The salt trade provided monasteries with a stable income in an unpredictable economy. Unlike grain harvests, which could fail due to drought or blight, salt production was less vulnerable to such risks, though heavy rains during the evaporation season could still cause losses. Monasteries used salt profits to fund charity, repair buildings, purchase manuscripts, and expand their landholdings. They also provided salt at reduced prices to the poor during lean years, a practice that strengthened their moral authority and their ties to the surrounding community. Political entanglements. The very success of monastic salt operations sometimes drew them into political conflict. Coastal lords might see monastic saltworks as competition to their own, leading to disputes over water rights or shipping privileges. In extreme cases, armed men were sent to seize salt shipments or block access to intake channels. Such conflicts were usually resolved through mediation by higher authorities, a bishop, a count, or even the king. The Cistercians' reputation for neutrality often worked in their favor, but it could not always shield them from the reality that salt was a strategic resource worth fighting over. Environmental stewardship. Salt ponds were living landscapes. Over time, embankments needed rebuilding, clay linings had to be repaired, and silt cleared from channels. The monks' careful management kept the system productive for generations. They also understood the ecological value of the salt marshes. They provided habitat for fish, shellfish, and migratory birds. Though the monks' primary goal was production, their methods were often more sustainable than those of later industrial saltworks. They used no chemical additives, relied on wind and sun rather than fuel, and maintained a balance between human use and natural renewal. From the outside, the Cistercian saltworks looked like a simple arrangement of ponds and dikes. But in reality, it was a hub where religion, economy, politics, and ecology met, and where every grain of salt carried with it a story of labor, negotiation, and careful stewardship. Still, one must wonder, what happened when external forces, war, plague, or royal policy disrupted this delicate balance? By the close of the Middle Ages, the world in which the Cistercian saltmakers had flourished was changing. War, disease, and the consolidation of royal power reshaped the salt trade, and even the most disciplined monastic operations could not remain untouched. War on the coast. The 14th and 15th centuries brought the Hundred Years' War, a conflict that rolled back and forth across France for over a century. While many of its decisive battles took place inland, the war's effects were felt keenly on the coast. Salt ponds, so vulnerable to disruption, became targets for raiding parties. English and French forces alike understood the value of salt in provisioning armies. Raids on saltworks could deprive an enemy of preserved food, disrupt local economies, and provide loot to be carried away. Some monasteries fortified their storehouses, while others dismantled their salt ponds temporarily to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Monks were not soldiers, but they found themselves negotiating with military commanders, seeking protection for their lands in exchange for supplies of salt. Such arrangements kept some saltworks running, but at the cost of drawing monasteries deeper into the politics of war. Plague and labor shortages. The Black Death of the mid-14th century killed an estimated third to half of Europe's population, and its impact on monastic communities was devastating. Many saltworks relied on a mix of monastic labor and hired lay workers. When plague swept through, both groups suffered losses. With fewer hands to maintain embankments and tend ponds, production sometimes fell sharply. Surviving monks took on additional tasks, but the sheer physical demands of salt harvesting limited how much they could do. In some cases, monasteries leased parts of their saltworks to local families in exchange for a share of the output, temporarily breaking with the tradition of direct monastic control. The rise of royal control. By the late medieval period, the French crown was steadily increasing its authority over valuable resources. Salt was a prime target. Even before the formal establishment of the gay bell in the 14th century, royal officials were seeking ways to tax and regulate salt production. For the monasteries, this meant new layers of bureaucracy, licenses for production, inspections, and restrictions on trade routes. In some regions, the crown claimed the right to purchase salt at fixed prices, cutting into monastic profits. While the Cistercians' political connections allowed them to negotiate exemptions in some cases, the trend was clear: salt was no longer a purely local or monastic affair. It was a matter of national policy. Adaptation and diversification. Faced with these pressures, some monastic communities diversified their economic base. They expanded their grain fields, developed vineyards, or invested in mills and fisheries. Salt remained important, but it was no longer the sole foundation of their wealth. Others specialized further, focusing on producing the highest quality salt for elite markets. This strategy relied on maintaining the strictest harvesting standards and building strong relationships with trusted merchants who could deliver the product to cities like Paris or Rouen. The long decline of monastic saltworks. By the early modern period, many monastic saltworks had passed into secular hands. Some were sold outright to raise funds during periods of financial strain. Others were confiscated during political upheavals. The French Revolution completed this process, as monastic lands were seized and sold as national property. Yet the infrastructure the monks had built, the ponds, channels, and storage houses, often continued in use under new owners. In some places, salt production remained active well into the industrial age, the medieval origins of the works fading into local memory. Traces in the present. Today, remnants of these monastic saltworks still shape the French coastline. In parts of Brittany and the Vendée, the layout of medieval ponds is visible from the air, a geometric patchwork etched into the tidal flats. Some have been restored for small-scale artisanal salt production, attracting visitors who marvel at the same slow, deliberate harvest that monks once performed in silence. Ecologists note that these restored salt ponds provide valuable habitat for wildlife, a reminder that the monks' work, though driven by economic need, also created enduring ecological niches. The birds that stalk the shallows today are descendants of those that shared the ponds with monks centuries ago. Reflection. The Cistercian salt harvesters lived in a world where economy, environment, and faith were inseparable. Their salt ponds were not just places of work, but reflections of their values, ordered, disciplined, and sustained through careful stewardship. Their story shows how something as seemingly humble as a grain of salt can sit at the center of vast systems feeding armies, shaping trade routes, attracting royal attention, and anchoring communities through centuries of change. And it leaves one to ponder. If the medieval monks could manage a resource with such balance and foresight, what does it say about the way we handle the strategic resources of our own age? Story 5. Threads of Empire, the Silk Weavers of Byzantium. It is the year 950 CE, and deep within the heart of Constantinople, the air is thick with the faint smell of boiled silk cocoons. You are standing in the Gynaikeon, one of the imperial silk workshops, where rows of women sit at great wooden looms, their fingers darting across warp and weft. Shafts of late morning light stream through the high windows, catching on the sheen of dyed threads, crimson, gold, and deep imperial purple. Here in the Byzantine Empire, silk is not merely a fabric. It is a state-controlled treasure, a symbol of imperial authority, and a key instrument of diplomacy. Every thread you see is part of a tightly guarded monopoly that stretches from the sericulture sheds to the emperor's own throne room. The long journey of silk to Byzantium. Silk was not native to the Mediterranean. For centuries, it came westward from China along the Silk Road, passing through Central Asia and Persia before reaching the Roman and later Byzantine world. By the early centuries of the empire, silk had become so prized that emperors spent vast sums importing it. The turning point came, according to later chronicles, in the mid-6th century. Two monks, traveling through Central Asia, allegedly smuggled silkworm eggs hidden in hollow canes back to Constantinople. Whether or not the story is entirely true, by the reign of Emperor Justinian I, 527–565 CE, the Byzantines had acquired the knowledge of sericulture, raising silkworms and producing raw silk. From that point forward, the empire guarded this knowledge fiercely. Sericulture and silk weaving became state enterprises, regulated as carefully as coinage or military arsenals. The imperial monopoly. By the 10th century, all high-quality silk production in Byzantium was under direct imperial control. Workshops like the Gynaecean in Constantinople operated under officials appointed by the Cum Sacrarum Largitionum, the Count of the Sacred Largesses. These officials oversaw every stage of the process: rearing silkworms, unwinding cocoons, spinning thread, dyeing, weaving, and embroidery. Private individuals could weave cloth, but they could not produce certain imperial grades of silk, especially those dyed in the fabled Tyrian purple. That color, extracted from the murex shellfish, was reserved by law for the emperor and his immediate family. Breaking these rules could lead to confiscation of goods, heavy fines, or worse. The monopoly ensured that silk remained a tool of political power as well as economic wealth. The weaving process. Inside the imperial workshops, the work began with raw silk thread, fine, strong, and lustrous. This thread was dyed using a variety of natural substances: madder for red, weld for yellow, indigo for blue, and for the most prestigious garments, the rare and costly Tyrian purple. Dyeing required immense skill to achieve consistent, vivid colors, and the recipes were closely guarded secrets. The dyed threads were dried and wound onto bobbins before being mounted on large vertical or horizontal looms. Weaving patterns ranged from simple tabby weaves to complex lampas or samite, which created richly textured, patterned cloth. Some designs featured repeating medallions with animals, floral motifs, or religious symbols. Gold thread, made by wrapping fine strips of gold leaf around a silk core, was often woven in to create shimmering highlights. These cloths were heavy, luxurious, and expensive, suitable for imperial robes, church vestments, or diplomatic gifts. Labor and skill. Weavers in the imperial workshops were highly skilled, often trained from a young age. Many were women, though men also worked as dyers, spinners, and supervisors. The work was exacting. A mistake in counting threads could ruin an entire piece of cloth, wasting weeks of labor and costly materials. The imperial monopoly meant that weavers were both privileged and restricted. They had stable employment and access to high-quality materials, but their craft was bound to the demands of the court. They could not simply take their skills to the open market without permission. Silk as diplomacy. Byzantine emperors used silk as a diplomatic currency. Bolts of fine silk were sent to foreign rulers as gifts, sometimes in exchange for peace, alliances, or trade agreements. Ambassadors from distant lands often left Constantinople laden with silk, a tangible sign of imperial favor. The control of silk also allowed the empire to influence its neighbors' economies. States that could not produce their own silk were forced to buy from Byzantium, keeping them dependent on imperial goodwill. The city's markets and the common silk trade. Not all silk in Constantinople came from the imperial workshops. Lower grades of silk and blended fabrics, such as silk mixed with wool or linen, were sold in the city's bustling markets. Merchants from Italy, the Middle East, and beyond came to buy these goods, though they often faced restrictions on the quantity and type they could purchase. Even so, the presence of silk in everyday markets gave the city an air of opulence. Travelers remarked on the richness of Byzantine dress and the dazzling variety of textiles displayed in shop windows. An ordinary day in the workshop. If you stood in the Gynaecean for an entire day, you would see a steady rhythm of work. At dawn, the looms are uncovered and threads checked for tension. Weavers work in pairs or small teams, speaking little, their hands moving in practiced motions. In the dyeing rooms, steam rises from vats as dyers stir the threads with long poles. Supervisors walk the floor, inspecting the work and making notes on wax tablets. By late afternoon, the day's weaving is rolled carefully to protect the threads, and tools are stored. The looms are covered to keep dust away, and the workers leave in small groups, their garments faintly scented with the dyes and fibers they have handled all day. The weaving of silk in Byzantium was not simply a craft. It was a political act, an economic engine, and a statement of imperial identity. But what happened when foreign rivals, especially in the Islamic world and later in Western Europe, began producing their own silk, challenging Byzantium's monopoly? In the first section, we saw how the Byzantine silk industry was a carefully guarded imperial monopoly, woven into the fabric of the empire's economy and diplomacy. Now, we move to the forces that began to test that monopoly: external rivals, shifting trade routes, and internal political pressures, and how the weavers adapted to a changing world. Rivals on the loom. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Byzantine monopoly faced new competition. The Islamic caliphates, particularly the Abbasid and later the Fatimid and Umayyad courts, had developed their own sophisticated silk industries. Cities like Damascus, Baghdad, and Cordoba produced silks of exceptional quality, often incorporating styles and motifs different from Byzantine tradition. These rivals did not just copy Byzantine designs. They innovated, introducing new weaving techniques, color palettes, and geometric patterns influenced by Islamic art. Merchants from across the Mediterranean now had choices, and some began to prefer certain foreign styles over the imperial ones. The Byzantines responded by refining their own designs and weaving more complex patterns. Workshops in Constantinople experimented with integrating foreign motifs, producing textiles that appealed to multiple markets while still maintaining the high technical standards of imperial silk. Smuggling and secrets. Despite strict laws, knowledge of Byzantine silk production inevitably leaked. Merchants, envoys, and even captured weavers carried techniques beyond imperial borders. Silk threads, dye recipes, and small weaving tools could be smuggled far more easily than entire bolts of finished cloth. Silk workers themselves were sometimes targets for recruitment by foreign rulers, tempted by promises of higher wages and greater freedom. The empire responded with tighter controls. Imperial weavers were often bound by lifelong contracts, and their movement outside the city was restricted without special permission. Still, over time, independent weaving centers sprang up in places like Sicily, southern Italy, and later in the Crusader states, where both Eastern and Western techniques blended. Each new center eroded Byzantium's unique hold on the craft. Silk as political messaging. Even as rivals emerged, the Byzantine court doubled down on silk as a symbol of imperial power. Court ceremonies became ever more elaborate, with silks playing a central role. The emperor's robes, woven in shimmering gold thread patterns, projected an image of divine authority. Official portraits and manuscripts depicted emperors seated on golden thrones, draped in rich silk garments. These images, distributed across the empire and to foreign courts, reinforced the association between silk and imperial legitimacy. Silk also became a key element in the praekypsis and Chrysotriclinos ceremonies, where the emperor appeared to the public surrounded by layers of draped silk, creating a physical and symbolic barrier between ruler and subjects. The guild system and quality control. By the 11th century, Constantinople's silk industry was organized into guilds, each responsible for a specific stage of production: spinning, dyeing, weaving, or embroidery. These guilds enforced quality standards, ensuring that imperial silks met the exacting requirements of the court. Guild regulations also controlled prices, working hours, and even the types of patterns that could be woven for different clients. The most complex and prestigious designs were reserved for imperial use or for gifts to foreign rulers. Lesser designs could be sold in markets but were still subject to inspection. This system maintained quality but also created rigidity. As foreign markets became more competitive, the guild restrictions sometimes slowed the industry's ability to adapt quickly to changing tastes. The economic web. silk production in Byzantium was not isolated. It was part of a broader economic network that included farmers raising mulberry trees, sericulture workers tending silkworms, dyers importing exotic pigments, and merchants moving finished cloth to markets across the Mediterranean. Taxes on silk production and sales provided significant revenue for the state. This income helped fund the army, maintain public works, and support the lavish court life for which Constantinople was famous. Losing dominance in silk would have meant more than a cultural setback. It would have been a fiscal blow to the empire's stability. Adapting to foreign demand. Foreign buyers did not always want the same motifs favored by the Byzantine court. In response, some workshops produced special export-line silks with hunting scenes for Islamic courts, or with heraldic designs for Western nobles. This adaptability kept Byzantine silk competitive even as rivals grew stronger. Merchants from Venice, Amalfi, and Genoa became important intermediaries in this trade, carrying Byzantine silks to distant markets. However, this growing reliance on foreign middlemen also made the empire vulnerable to shifting alliances and trade disputes. The loom as a diplomatic tool. In times of political tension, silk could open doors that armies could not. When negotiations with foreign rulers stalled, an imperial gift of fine silk could serve as both a peace offering and a subtle reminder of Byzantine wealth. These diplomatic silks were not simply handed over, they were presented in ceremonies designed to impress. The bolts might be unrolled in front of the recipient, revealing their shimmering patterns under torchlight. Each piece represented months of labor and the full power of imperial craftsmanship. The strain of war and sea. The 11th and 12th centuries saw the empire facing renewed military pressures from Normans, Seljuk Turks, and later Crusaders. Sieges disrupted trade routes, and resources that might have gone to silk production were diverted to the defense of the city. Yet even in times of hardship, the imperial workshops continued to operate, a deliberate choice to maintain the outward appearance of stability and abundance. The sight of the emperor in full silk regalia, even during a crisis, sent a message that the empire's resources and prestige were intact. Still, one must ask, how long could the Byzantines maintain their grip on the silk trade in the face of rising competition, political instability, and the slow leakage of their most closely guarded secrets? By the 13th century, the Byzantine silk monopoly, once a gleaming pillar of imperial wealth and prestige, was entering a period of decline. The reasons were many: foreign competition, shifting political power, and the growing inability of the empire to control its own trade networks. Yet even in its twilight, Byzantine silk retained an aura that no rival could entirely match. The Crusader disruption. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 dealt an almost fatal blow to Constantinople's silk industry. When the city was sacked, the imperial workshops were looted, their looms dismantled or carried off, their stockpiles of precious cloth seized. Western chroniclers describe bolts of imperial silk being cut up to make altar cloths and banners for churches in Venice, Paris, and beyond. Many skilled weavers fled or were captured, taking their knowledge to Italy and other parts of Europe. This diaspora accelerated the spread of Byzantine weaving techniques to new centers, especially in Venice, Lucca, and Palermo, cities that would soon become leading producers of silk in their own right. Fragmentation of the monopoly. After the empire was restored in 1261 under the Palaiologos dynasty, efforts were made to rebuild the silk industry. Imperial workshops reopened, and guild regulations were reimposed, but the monopoly could no longer be enforced as tightly. Too many rivals now produced silk of comparable quality, and too many foreign merchants had direct access to the materials and techniques once kept secret. Byzantine silks still carried prestige, especially those bearing traditional court patterns, but they no longer dominated the Mediterranean trade. The empire was now one of several respected producers, rather than the sole source of the most coveted cloth. The changing market. The tastes of Europe were shifting. Western courts, enriched by crusader spoils and trade profits, commissioned their own designs, blending Byzantine motifs with Gothic and Islamic influences. Hunting scenes, heraldic emblems, and stylized foliage replaced some of the older medallion patterns. Byzantine weavers adapted where they could, but the guild system, still bound by layers of tradition, was slow to embrace radical change. While Constantinople could still produce exquisite cloth, the sheer variety and volume coming from Italy and the Islamic world began to overshadow it in the wider market. Silk in the late Byzantine court. Despite diminished dominance, silk retained its ceremonial role within the empire. The emperor and high-ranking officials continued to wear robes of silk woven with gold thread during state occasions, religious processions, and diplomatic receptions. Church vestments, too, remained heavily reliant on silk, often adorned with elaborate embroidery depicting saints and biblical scenes. In this period, much of the finest silk was directed inward, to reinforce imperial dignity and ecclesiastical splendor, rather than to compete in international markets. This focus preserved the symbolic value of silk even as its commercial power waned. The looms in shadow. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Byzantine silk industry had contracted significantly. Wars with the Ottomans, internal political instability, and the shrinking of the empire's territory reduced access to both raw materials and trade networks. Mulberry cultivation and sericulture survived in some areas, but large-scale production became rare. Weavers still labored in Constantinople, but their output was modest compared to earlier centuries. Much of the silk used in the city was now imported from Italy or the Islamic world, a reversal of the old order. Legacy in the Ottoman era. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the remaining imperial workshops were absorbed into the new regime's textile economy. Some Byzantine weavers continued their craft under Ottoman patronage, contributing to the flourishing silk industry of Bursa and later Istanbul. Elements of Byzantine design persisted in Ottoman court silks, a quiet echo of the empire that had once ruled the trade. Surviving masterpieces. Today, fragments of Byzantine silk survive in cathedral treasuries, museums, and monasteries. Many were repurposed centuries ago, cut into church vestments, reliquary coverings, or altar frontals. The surviving pieces display the hallmarks of the craft: intricate patterns, balanced composition, and a sheen that has endured through the ages. Scholars study these fragments to reconstruct weaving techniques, dye recipes, and the movement of designs across cultures. Each surviving thread speaks to the interconnectedness of medieval trade and the role of textiles as carriers of cultural influence. Reflection. The story of Byzantine silk is a story of mastery and adaptation, but also of how even the most jealously guarded monopoly can erode under the pressure of time, politics, and human ambition. For centuries, the empire's silk weavers worked at the intersection of art, industry, and diplomacy, producing cloth that clothed emperors, adorned churches, and traveled as far as China and England. Even after the monopoly was broken, the aesthetic and technical legacy of Byzantine silk lived on in the looms of Venice, the embroidery of Spain, and the brocades of the Ottoman court. Its decline was not the end of the tradition, but its transformation into something broader and more diffused. And it leaves one to consider: when a craft is born in secrecy and thrives in exclusivity, does it inevitably lose something essential when it becomes shared with the wider world, or does it, in that sharing, achieve a different kind of immortality? Story 6. The canal that fed a city Rome's Aqua Claudia. The year is 52 CE, and you are standing on the Appian Way, looking up at a line of massive stone arches stretching into the distance. They march across the countryside like a procession of giants, carrying water toward the heart of Rome. This is the Aqua Claudia, one of the most ambitious aqueducts the Roman Empire ever built, and in this moment it is newly completed, a marvel of engineering, imperial will, and sheer persistence. A city thirsting for water. By the middle of the 1st century CE, Rome was a city of perhaps 1 million people and unprecedented size in the ancient world. Such a population required an immense and constant supply of fresh water for drinking, bathing, fountains, public baths, thermae, private households, and even decorative water features in gardens and courtyards. Earlier aqueducts like the Aqua Appia, Aqua Marcia, and Aqua Tepula already supplied the city, but demand kept rising. As Rome expanded, so did the need for new sources. The emperors recognized that water was not merely a utility, it was a political tool. A well-supplied city was content and impressed with its ruler's generosity. The vision of the Aqua Claudia. Construction of the Aqua Claudia began under Emperor Caligula in 38 CE. Caligula, known more for his erratic behavior than for his public works, nonetheless initiated several large-scale infrastructure projects, perhaps to bolster his reputation. The Aqua Claudia was one of them, drawing water from 2 springs, the Caeruleus and the Curtius, near the modern town of Subiaco, about 45 miles east of Rome. The plan was ambitious. The aqueduct would carry water along a winding route through hills, across valleys, and over the famed arches that would become its most visible symbol. Work progressed unevenly during Caligula's reign, and after his assassination in 41 CE, the project passed to Emperor Claudius. Claudius takes the helm. Claudius, often underestimated by his contemporaries, proved to be an effective and detail-oriented ruler when it came to infrastructure. He oversaw the completion of the Aqua Claudia and officially dedicated it in 52 CE, along with another aqueduct, the Annio Novus. Under Claudius, the construction was refined and expanded. The channels were lined with opus signinum A waterproof mortar made of crushed tiles and lime to reduce leakage. Maintenance access points were added, and bridges were strengthened to withstand the weight of the water and the occasional earthquakes that shook the region. Anatomy of an aqueduct. The Aqua Claudia's total length was around 69 kilometers, 43 miles, but much of this was underground. Roman engineers preferred to dig covered channels whenever possible, both to protect the water from contamination and to reduce the risk of damage. The most famous sections, the towering arches, were reserved for areas where the terrain dipped too deeply for a covered channel. The last several miles before reaching Rome were carried on these stone arcades, some of them over 30 meters high. Built of opus quadratum, large squared blocks of tufa and travertine, the arches were both functional and a display of imperial grandeur. At its source, the Aqua Claudia delivered water of remarkable clarity, prized for drinking. Its flow rate was substantial, estimated at about 190,000 cubic meters per day, enough to supply a significant portion of the city's needs. Water distribution in the city. Once the aqueduct reached the city, its water entered a distribution system called the Castellum Divisorium, essentially a large water tower or basin. From here, lead or terracotta pipes, fistulae, carried water to various districts, public fountains, lacus, and bath complexes. Wealthier households could pay for a private connection, which came with its own lead pipe stamped with the owner's name. This privilege was jealously guarded, and unauthorized tapping of the aqueduct water theft was punishable by law. Labor and maintenance. The construction of the Aqua Claudia required thousands of laborers, from unskilled diggers to skilled masons and hydraulic engineers. Once operational, the aqueduct needed constant maintenance. Silt and mineral deposits could clog the channels, plant roots could penetrate the mortar, and earthquakes or floods could damage the arches. A dedicated workforce of aquarii, watermen, and curators aquarum, water overseers, patrolled the length of the aqueduct, inspecting for leaks, clearing blockages and making repairs. These workers were part of a specialized corps within Rome's public service, and their knowledge of hydraulics was extensive. The aqueduct as imperial propaganda. For Claudius, the Aqua Claudia was more than a feat of engineering, it was a public statement. Inscriptions along the aqueduct proclaimed his role in completing it, subtly contrasting his diligence with Caligula's erratic leadership. The arches themselves, visible for miles, were monuments to Roman order and capability. For ordinary Romans, the Aqua Claudia was a tangible benefit of imperial rule. Fresh, abundant water made daily life more comfortable, supported public health, and allowed for the maintenance of baths, fountains, and ornamental pools, all of which reinforced the image of Rome as the pinnacle of civilization. Yet the story of the Aqua Claudia would not remain one of uninterrupted triumph. Within just a few decades, the mighty aqueduct faced its first great challenges, and those challenges revealed the fragility of even the most solid Roman stone. When Claudius dedicated the Aqua Claudia in 52 CE, he may have believed it would serve the city for centuries without interruption. The structure was massive, the engineering sound, and the water abundant. Yet, like many Roman works, its true test would come not in the glory of its inauguration, but in the decades and centuries of wear, repair, and human interference that followed. Early interruptions in service. Remarkably, within just 10 years of its completion, the Aqua Claudia was already showing signs of trouble. Records from the reign of Emperor Vespasian, 69-79 CE, note that the aqueduct had fallen into disrepair by the mid-60s CE. A combination of factors likely caused this: earthquake damage, the settling of foundations, and the mineral buildup that plagued all aqueducts over time. Vespasian and his son Titus undertook extensive restorations, with inscriptions proudly declaring their role in restoring the Aqua Claudia to its full flow. Such repairs were not minor touch-ups, they often involved dismantling sections of the arches, rebuilding channels, and resealing joints with fresh opus signinum. The problem of water theft. Another recurring problem was unauthorized tapping. Though Roman law was clear only those with a legal grant could take water, the temptation for illicit connections was great. Wealthy villa owners along the route sometimes bribed workers to insert unauthorized pipes, diverting water for private gardens and baths. Water inspectors patrolled the route, searching for telltale signs: freshly disturbed earth, suspiciously lush vegetation, or unexplained drops in water pressure. Removing illegal taps was a constant game of cat and mouse, with offenders sometimes facing heavy fines or the confiscation of their lead pipes. Integration with other aqueducts. By the late 1st century CE, the Aqua Claudia was part of a complex network of 11 aqueducts supplying Rome. Engineers sometimes linked aqueducts together to balance supply. In dry seasons, the Aqua Claudia could be supplemented with water from the Anio Novus, and in times of excess, it could feed into other lines. This interconnectedness increased resilience, but also meant that a failure in one aqueduct could ripple through the whole system. A breach in the Claudia's channel could disrupt not just its own customers, but others relying on its diverted flow. An architectural marvel in stone and brick. The most iconic sections of the Aqua Claudia, the great arcades near Rome, became as much part of the city's visual identity as the Colosseum or the Forum. Roman writers commented on their grandeur, and travelers entering the city from the south or east would pass under their shadow. The arches were not uniform. Some were built entirely in stone, others incorporated brick repairs from later centuries. These layers of construction tell a story of ongoing care and adaptation, as each generation of Romans repaired, reinforced, or modified the structure to meet new needs. The Claudia in public life. The water from the Aqua Claudia supplied major public baths such as the Baths of Titus and later the Baths of Trajan. These massive complexes, with their hot and cold pools, fountains, and steam rooms were not luxuries for the elite alone, they were public amenities that served thousands daily. Public fountains, too, depended on aqueduct water. These lacus were strategically placed in neighborhoods, each with multiple spouts so residents could fill their amphorae or buckets. The constant sound of running water was one of the defining sensory experiences of Rome, and the Claudia contributed significantly to that soundtrack. Siege and survival. Rome's aqueducts were not invulnerable to politics or war. In times of siege, cutting an aqueduct could be a devastating tactic, depriving the city of clean water. While Rome itself was not besieged in the early empire, later centuries would see invading armies target these lifelines. The Claudia, with its long elevated sections, was particularly exposed. Defensive measures included stationing guards at key points and keeping some sections hidden underground where possible. Still, the sheer length of the aqueduct made complete protection impossible. Symbol of imperial stability. As emperors came and went, some remembered for cruelty, others for competence, the aqueducts stood as visible symbols of continuity. Inscriptions recording repairs became a subtle form of political propaganda, a way for rulers to align themselves with the stability and generosity that the aqueducts represented. When Emperor Hadrian restored sections of the Aqua Claudia, he did so with inscriptions prominently displayed, linking his name to the constant, life-giving flow of water into Rome. It was a quiet but effective way of asserting that, under his rule, the city's needs were met. The creep of decay. Yet despite constant attention, the Claudia aged. Lime scale accumulated inside the channel, narrowing the flow. Mortar cracked under seasonal temperature changes. Vegetation found its way into joints, prying apart the carefully placed stones. Maintenance crews fought these processes endlessly, but Rome's aqueduct system was vast, and resources were finite. By the late 3rd century CE, during periods of political and economic crisis, repairs could be delayed for years, causing entire stretches of the aqueduct to fall silent. The Aqua Claudia had been built to embody Rome's mastery over nature, but could even Rome's engineering prowess hold back the combined forces of time, neglect, and invasion? By the time the Western Roman Empire staggered into the 5th century CE, the Aqua Claudia had been carrying water toward Rome for nearly 400 years. It had survived earthquakes, emperors, and political upheavals, but the world around it was changing, and the aqueduct's fate was increasingly tied to forces beyond engineering skill. The Gothic sieges. In 537 CE, during the Gothic War, the Ostrogothic king Witigis besieged Rome. Knowing the city's dependence on aqueducts, he ordered their channels cut or blocked. The Aqua Claudia was among those targeted. According to the historian Procopius, the aqueducts were not just interrupted at one point but deliberately dismantled in multiple places to prevent quick repairs. Without the Claudia and other lines, the water supply to the baths and fountains was crippled. Romans resorted to drawing water from the Tiber, a risky source, polluted and prone to carrying disease. Decline in maintenance. Even after the siege was lifted, the Claudia never fully returned to its former glory. The city's population had shrunk drastically, reducing the tax base that funded large-scale repairs. Skilled maintenance crews, once a professional corps, became scarce. The aqueduct's long stretches of elevated arches, so impressive in the imperial age, became liabilities. Without constant upkeep, joints loosened and whole sections could collapse. By the 6th and 7th centuries, much of the Claudia's waterway lay dry or broken. Adaptive reuse. Yet even in decay, the aqueduct's remains found new purposes. Farmers used the sheltered spaces beneath the arches for storage or as animal pens. In some cases, local builders quarried stone from the structure, repurposing its well-cut blocks for churches, fortifications, or houses. The elevated arches became landmarks in the rural landscape, guiding travelers and serving as convenient boundaries for fields. In certain stretches, later rulers repaired portions of the channel to supply monasteries or fortified estates, keeping fragments of the Claudia alive in a piecemeal way. Medieval memory of a Roman wonder. In the medieval period, the Aqua Claudia was remembered not as a functioning waterway, but as part of the mysterious grandeur of the works of the ancients. Pilgrims and chroniclers marveled at the sheer scale of the remaining arches, sometimes exaggerating their height or extent in their descriptions. The channel itself was often inaccessible, filled with debris or choked by vegetation. Local legends claim that treasure was hidden within a common belief attached to ancient ruins. Renaissance rediscovery. In the 15th and 16th centuries, during the Renaissance, interest in restoring ancient aqueducts grew. The Papal States sought to revive Rome's water supply as part of a broader project to beautify and repopulate the city. Pope Sixtus V in the late 1500s oversaw the partial restoration of the Aqua Claudia, using it to supply the Aqua Fellis, a new line feeding fountains and districts on the Quirinal Hill. This was not a full revival. Much of the original route remained derelict, but it marked a moment when ancient engineering was not just admired but reactivated. Surviving arches. Today, visitors to Rome can still see impressive stretches of the Aqua Claudia's arcades, especially in the Parco degli Aquedotti. Here, the giant arches stride across open fields much as they did in antiquity, though stripped of their functional channels. In some places, medieval and Renaissance repairs are visible alongside the original Roman stonework, creating a layered history in a single structure. These ruins continue to shape the city's identity, a reminder that Rome's greatness was built not only on military conquest or monumental temples, but on the unglamorous yet vital infrastructure that sustained urban life. Lessons from the Claudia. The story of the Aqua Claudia is one of ambition, adaptation, and eventual decline. At its peak, it was a marvel of hydraulic engineering, carrying clear spring water across dozens of miles with a precision that astonishes modern engineers. Its operation required careful planning, constant maintenance, and the political will to fund it. But it also reveals the fragility of complex systems. When the political and economic structures that supported maintenance collapsed, even Rome's greatest aqueducts could not endure indefinitely. Reflection. Standing beneath the silent arches today, you can imagine the steady, unseen flow that once moved above you, water destined for the baths of emperors, the fountains of marketplaces, and the humble pitchers of Rome's residents. You can also sense the centuries of change. The moment when this marvel was built to serve a growing city, the pride of emperors who restored it, the desperation of sieges that silenced it, and the slow fatting of a system that had once defined urban life. And it invites the question, when a civilization builds a work to last for centuries, is its true legacy found in how long it functions or in how it continues to inspire, even after its practical use has ended? Story 7. Counting the Empire, the Census of Augustus. It is the year 28 BCE, and the Roman Republic, or what remains of it, is under the firm control of one man, Gaius Octavius, known to history as Augustus. The civil wars have ended, and the smoke of political chaos is giving way to the ordered calm of imperial administration. Amid the rebuilding of temples and the reform of armies, Augustus embarks on a task that seems, on its surface, far less dramatic: counting people. This is the census, an ancient Roman institution now being reshaped to fit an empire that stretches from Spain to Syria. The origins of the Roman census. The census was one of the oldest Roman institutions, traditionally credited to King Servius Tullius in the 6th century BCE. In the early Republic, it was a civic ritual conducted every 5 years by 2 elected censors. Citizens would gather in the Campus Martius and declare their name, family, property, and dependents. The purpose was not merely demographic curiosity, it was the foundation for political, military, and fiscal organization. The census determined who could vote, how much tax one owed, and what military service one was eligible for. By the late Republic, however, the civil wars and political breakdown had disrupted regular census taking. The office of the censors had been left vacant for years at a time, and the system had grown patchy, outdated, and vulnerable to manipulation. Augustus and the need for order. Augustus understood that a functioning empire required accurate information about its people and their wealth. The census was more than a headcount, it was a way to reassert state authority over every citizen, to know who they were, where they lived, and what they owned. By reviving and expanding the census, Augustus could also root his power in the old traditions of the Republic. The act of counting the population linked him to Rome's earliest kings and most respected magistrates, even as he quietly concentrated unprecedented power in his own hands. The First Imperial Census, 28 BCE. In 28 BCE, Augustus, alongside his co-ruler, Agrippa, conducted the first census of his reign. This was no small task. Citizens were required to appear in person, swear an oath, and provide detailed declarations. The scale of the operation reflected the empire's size. In addition to Rome itself, officials in provincial towns gathered information, often with local elites supervising the process. The results were tallied and brought to the capital, where they were recorded in the official lists. Ancient sources report that the census of 28 BCE counted 4,063,000 Roman citizens, a number that excluded women, slaves, and non-citizen residents of the empire. The figure represented freeborn or legally enfranchised men, many of whom would also serve in the legions. Ritual and ceremony. The census was more than paperwork. It concluded with the lustrum, a purification ceremony conducted in the Campus Martius. This involved a sacrifice, traditionally a pig, a sheep, and a bull, to cleanse the citizen body and mark the completion of the 5-year cycle. Under Augustus, the lustrum became a public demonstration of stability and order. The emperor could stand before the assembled citizens, not as a tyrant demanding obedience, but as a traditional magistrate fulfilling ancient duties. It was a subtle but powerful piece of political theater. Why it mattered. For Augustus, the census provided essential data for taxation and military service. While most direct taxes were levied in the provinces rather than in Italy, the census helped track property ownership and wealth distribution, which informed broader fiscal policy. In military terms, knowing the number of eligible citizens was crucial for planning troop levies. Even as Augustus professionalized the legions and reduced their reliance on annual recruitment, the state still needed accurate rosters of manpower. The census also had social and moral implications. Augustus used it to enforce his marriage and morality laws, ensuring that citizens conformed to the expectations of the Roman family system. The census as a tool of control. Beneath its orderly exterior, the census was also a mechanism of imperial control. To be counted was to be known by the state and to be held accountable. Citizens who failed to register could lose legal rights or face fines. False declarations could lead to prosecution. This centralization of information allowed Augustus to knit the vast empire together in a way that earlier leaders had not achieved. Local variation persisted, but the core idea was the same from one end of the empire to the other. Rome knew who you were, what you owned, and where you belonged. Expanding the scope. While the 28 BCE census focused primarily on Roman citizens, Augustus would later extend similar surveys to provincial populations. These were not always called census in the formal sense, but they served the same purpose: measuring taxable wealth, organizing land records, and ensuring military obligations were met. The most famous of these provincial censuses, at least in later Christian tradition, was the one linked to the Nativity story, when Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem for registration. Whether or not that specific event aligns with historical fact, it reflects the reality that Augustus' administrative reach extended even into small towns far from the capital. Yet the very act of counting carried political risks. In a world where numbers reflected power, who was counted and how could provoke resentment or resistance. In some provinces, the census would become a flashpoint for rebellion. And for Augustus, even as he celebrated the orderly rows of figures in the state registers, the challenge remained. Could the census truly encompass an empire as vast and varied as Rome? By the early years of the 1st century CE, Augustus had conducted not just his initial census of 28 BCE, but two more, one in 8 BCE and another in 14 CE, the year of his death. Each successive count refined the empire's picture of itself, and each revealed the growing complexity of administering such a vast and diverse realm. The mechanics of counting an empire. The census was never a purely local event. In the provinces, officials dispatched from Rome, often members of the equestrian order, worked alongside local magistrates and elite landowners. Notices were posted in public spaces announcing the requirement for registration. In some cases, traveling clerks set up temporary stations in villages and market towns to take declarations. Each registrant was expected to provide their name, age, occupation, and the number of dependents in their household. Property declarations were more involved. Land boundaries were described in relation to neighboring plots, livestock numbers were recorded, and in urban areas, building ownership was noted. For wealthier citizens, declarations could run to pages of detailed inventory. Logistics and record keeping. Once collected, the information had to be transmitted to Rome. In Italy, this meant couriers carrying parchment rolls to the capital. In distant provinces, copies were sent by sea when weather allowed, with duplicates kept in regional archives in case of loss. The central records were stored in the tabularium, Rome's great state archive near the Forum. Here, scribes organized the data by tribe or district for citizens, and by province for non-citizen subjects. Rome's record-keeping was meticulous for the time, but it was not foolproof. Accidents, fire, mildew, shipwreck could wipe out months of work. For that reason, Augustus invested heavily in redundancy. Multiple copies, local and central, were the empire's safeguard. The 8 BCE census. The census of 8 BCE was notable for recording a significant increase in citizen numbers, over 4,200,000 men. This reflected the steady expansion of citizenship rights, both through the naturalization of whole communities and the granting of individual status to veterans, allies, and provincials who had rendered service to Rome. This growth was politically useful for Augustus. A larger citizen body meant a larger pool of men eligible for service, but it also meant a broader base of people tied directly to Rome's legal and cultural system. Citizenship was not just a legal category, it was a tool of integration. Social engineering through numbers. Augustus used the census to reinforce his moral and social legislation. His marriage laws penalized unmarried men and rewarded those with children, and the census was the instrument by which compliance could be checked. For example, the census rolls could be used to identify men who were still bachelors past a certain age, or couples without registered offspring. These individuals could face restrictions in inheritance rights, while those with larger families could enjoy tax benefits or preferential treatment in public office. Provincial censuses and tensions. Outside Italy, provincial censuses often served as the foundation for tax assessment. This made them far more controversial. In Judea, for instance, the census ordered in 6 CE by the governor Quirinius triggered a revolt led by Judas the Galilean. To many provincials, the census was not a benign administrative tool but a precursor to heavier tax burdens. Rome's governors had to tread carefully. In some regions, local customs were accommodated, such as allowing declarations to be made in local temples or in the presence of traditional authorities to soften resistance. In others, the process was enforced more rigidly, with soldiers present to ensure compliance. Counting in a world without uniformity. One of the challenges Augustus faced was the sheer diversity of the empire. In Gaul, for example, property was often held communally by extended kin groups, making it difficult to assign individual tax responsibilities. In Egypt, by contrast, detailed land registers already existed from the Ptolemaic period, providing a ready-made bureaucratic framework. This meant that the census was not a single, uniform procedure, but an adaptable concept, molded to fit local realities while still producing data that could feed into Rome's central administration. Political messaging. Whenever the results of a census were announced, Augustus made sure they were framed as proof of Rome's strength and prosperity. In public inscriptions such as those recorded in the Res Gesti Divi Augusti, his autobiographical account, The Rising Number of Citizens, was presented as evidence of the empire's stability and expansion. By linking his rule to population growth, Augustus reinforced the idea that his leadership was fostering peace, Pax Romana, encouraging family life, and binding the empire together in shared civic identity. The personal hand of the emperor. Though much of the work was done by subordinates, Augustus often attended the formal declarations in Rome himself. Ancient authors note his visible presence in the Campus Martius, greeting citizens and overseeing the process. This personal involvement was symbolic, the emperor as the guardian of tradition, custodian of the state's moral order, and ultimate overseer of its demographic health. Even in an empire of millions, Augustus projected an image of personal attention to every citizen. The census, then, was both a practical necessity and a piece of political theater, a way to count the empire while reminding it who was doing the counting. Yet for all its orderliness, the census faced inherent limits. How accurate could such counts be in a world of scattered farms, distant provinces, and fluid social categories? And what happened when those limits collided with imperial ambition? By the time Augustus died in 14 CE, the census had been firmly re-established as a pillar of imperial administration. The counts of 28 BCE, 8 BCE, and 14 CE marked a new era in statecraft, one in which numbers were as essential to power as armies or laws. But the legacy of this system would extend far beyond Augustus' reign, influencing the way Rome thought about itself for centuries. The 14 CE census, a final count. The last census Augustus oversaw personally took place in 14 CE, completed shortly before his death at Nola. This final enumeration recorded 4,937,000 citizens, nearly 900,000 more than the first count under his rule. This growth reflected both natural increase and the deliberate expansion of citizenship through grants to individuals, communities, and veterans. It also served as a parting demonstration of Augustus' administrative success. The empire he left to Tiberius was larger, more integrated, and more carefully documented than the one he had inherited. From republic to empire in numbers. The transformation of the census under Augustus mirrored the political shift from republic to empire. In the Republican era, the census was an act of shared civic participation, run by elected censors, and tied directly to voting rights in the assemblies. By Augustus' time, the assemblies were little more than ceremonial, and the census had become a top-down process under the emperor's supervision. The old participatory element remained in form. Citizens still appeared in the Campus Martius, but its meaning had changed. The census no longer determined political voice so much as it confirmed an individual's place within an imperial hierarchy. The census beyond Augustus. After Augustus' death, his successors continued the practice. Tiberius held censuses in 20 CE and 47 CE, Claudius in 48 CE, and so on. The regularity of these counts varied, sometimes stretching to 14 or 20 years between enumerations. But the model Augustus had set, combining ritual tradition with practical administration, remained intact. Some emperors, such as Vespasian, would adapt the census to their own needs, especially in reorganizing provincial tax systems. Others, like Trajan, used census data to plan infrastructure and military campaigns. Provincial impact. In the provinces, the Augustan approach to census staking became the template for Roman taxation and legal administration. Egypt, with its long tradition of record-keeping, kept the most detailed and frequent censuses every 14 years, providing historians today with remarkably complete snapshots of households, occupations, and property ownership. In regions less accustomed to bureaucracy, census staking was slower to take root. Still, the presence of Roman officials with their tablets, lists, and measuring cords became a familiar sight, a visible reminder of the empire's reach into everyday life. Accuracy and limitations. Despite Augustus' reforms, the census was never perfectly accurate. In rural areas, people might avoid registration to escape taxes or military service. In cities, property declarations could be understated to reduce obligations. The state tried to counter these evasions through local informants, cross-checking land records, and occasional audits, but some level of underreporting was inevitable. Even so, the census provided a workable, if imperfect, map of the empire's human and economic resources. The political uses of numbers. Perhaps the most important innovation of Augustus' census was its use as a political narrative tool. The figures themselves, citizen totals, were not just administrative data, they were propaganda. They appeared in public inscriptions, triumphal speeches, and imperial decrees as proof of the empire's vitality. By presenting the census as a sign of Rome's health, Augustus tied his own image to the flourishing of the citizen body. This was more than symbolic. In an age without modern polling, the census was one of the few ways to quantify the strength of the state. Moral and social engineering. The census also gave Augustus a framework for shaping Roman society. By recording marital status, family size, and property holdings, the state could reward or penalize behavior in line with the emperor's moral agenda. Though these measures were sometimes unpopular, especially among the upper classes, who resented interference in their private lives, they underscored Augustus' belief that a strong moral order was as important to the empire's survival as military might. A lasting legacy. The administrative model Augustus developed endured for centuries. Even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the idea of a periodic census persisted in successor states, influencing medieval tax rolls, land surveys, and population counts. In a sense, Augustus' census anticipated the modern state's reliance on demographic data. By quantifying its population, Rome could better mobilize resources, manage provinces, and project stability. The very act of counting became a form of governance. Reflection. When Augustus stood in the Campus Martius, overseeing rows of citizens reciting their names and fortunes, he was doing more than compiling a list. He was shaping a vision of Rome, a vast, ordered community bound by law, tradition, and loyalty to the emperor. The numbers on his tablets were abstractions, yet behind each digit stood a person: a farmer in Umbria, a merchant in Antioch, a veteran on a pension in Spain. In collecting these lives into a single set of figures, Augustus made the empire tangible in a way that could be stored, studied, and remembered.